Everyone, welcome to tonight's Perspectives in History program. My name's Kerry Cox. I am a staff member here at the Old State House Museum, and just want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and want to thank our young professionals group, the Arkansas State House Society, for helping us co-sponsor this program. And also many thanks to our panelists, Dr. Kelly Jones, Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch, and Dr. Brian Mitchell. And of course, the topic of tonight's program is the Sum of All Reckonings, what we know and don't know about Arkansas's African-American heritage. And what we're going to try to explore tonight is just what's the state of Arkansas's African-American history? What do we know? How did we get there as far as building that knowledge base? And of course, then we want to look at things like, well, where do we need to go? Where do we want to go to for further exploration? What are the problems that have been encountered in the past? What are going to be some of the possible problems that we can identify right now that are going to be as we go into the future, dealing with expanding that knowledge and promoting it to Arkansans. So that's kind of the gist of our program. This is, as Kwami told us earlier, this is going to be a pretty free-flowing panel. It's not going to be very rigid. His term, to be precise, was controlled chaos, and he's the one who's running this show. So good luck to him in keeping the chaos controlled. So I do want to make note that in the chat we have posted the link that if somebody would like to make a donation, they can still do that. That link will still be live after the program for 2 or 3 days. Don't feel obligated to, but if you would like to, please do so. Also, we have a brown bag lunch lecture coming up next week that I think you will enjoy. It is being presented by one of our fellow staff members, Latanya Wilson, and the program will be next Thursday, February the 24th. It will be broadcast live on Zoom, and you can find the link to that program on our Facebook page and on the Old State House Facebook page. And the program is going to be African-American legislators at the Old State House. And it will focus on the African-Americans who served in the Arkansas State Legislature in the post-Reconstruction era up until the early 1890s. So should be a good program. So I encourage you, if you can get away for lunch next Thursday, to tune into that. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, and then he can take it away. Our moderator this evening is Kwami Abdul-Bey. He is a one-time former middle school social studies teacher. I won't say how long ago that was, but he has been involved in community outreach and youth education and social justice movement for at least 25 years. And he has worked in broadcast media with KABF and KUAR, and also with the AETN, and as well as internet broadcasting, and he is the co-founder of the Ouachita Foothills Youth Media Arts and Literacy Collective. That's really a mouthful, you know? And he is also the co-convener of currently the co-convener of the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement. He is the founder of Investing in Black Futures, which is a nonprofit that is right now working to revitalize the community south of I-630 here in Little Rock. He is currently a candidate for the Master of Public Service degree at the Clinton School of Public Service, as well as, you're a busy man, as well as a Master of Public Administration candidate at UALR. So without any further ado, please welcome Kwami. Take it away, Kwami.
Turn on your mic.
I can get a public history degree out of that. I guess I can do that as well too. But good evening, everyone. What I would like for everyone to do, this program will be in two parts. First, we have the panel. While the panel is talking, if everyone else can turn off your sound and your video, so that we can hear the panel and concentrate on the panel. And then once we open it up for discussion with everybody, then you can turn on your video. So just if everyone could turn off your video and turn off your mics, that'd be greatly appreciated. Now, as far as the panel is concerned, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a short introduction as far as who they are, where they are, and then we're going to do a round robin with a couple of questions so you can get an idea of who they be, like we say in the hood. First, we have Dr. Brian K. Mitchell, an associate professor of history at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and the 2021 Phyllis Whitley Book Award winner. Isn't that correct, Brian?
Yes,
You're muted.
I appreciate you mentioning that. I'm sorry. Talking to myself there for a moment.
Yeah, panelists, we can unmute ourselves so that we don't have challenges moving forward. Next, we have Dr. Kelly Houston Jones, an assistant professor of history at Arkansas Tech University in Russellville. And finally, we have Dr. Cherisse Jones Branch. She's the graduate school dean and Vaughn Endowed Professor of History at Arkansas State University in Russellville. I will say that she's also the 2021-2022 Arkansas Council on Education and Lumina Foundation Fellow. And I got to give some breaking news for both Kelly and Cherisse. Kelly today received her letter of tenure. Kelly, everybody congratulate Kelly. You have some words you want to say about that? You're muted.
I'm fixing to have opinions now that I'm going to be tenured.
All right, she can actually say what's on her mind. And Cherisse, you were just appointed today by the governor to the Commission on the Status of Women in Arkansas. So we're going to call you Commish. Is that okay with you?
I guess.
Yes. Anything you want to say about that commission and what work you are getting ready to embark upon?
Only that it's a great honor, and I'm looking forward to doing research on the status of the women in the state and meeting other women from across the state. And this actually makes me a two-time commissioner because I'm also a commissioner on the Black History Commission of Arkansas.
Indeed, indeed. And we're definitely going to get into that as well. Let's do a round robin, and I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions. First, what is the last book you published, and give us a one-sentence synopsis. Kelly.
I thought you were gonna ask about the last book I read. The last book.
That's on my list too.
Only book I've published so far, and it's called A Weary Land, Slavery on the Ground in Arkansas. And it's the first book-length published study of slavery in Arkansas since 1958. And so overdue. And one sentence synopsis, the place and concept of Arkansas was created by the labor of enslaved people on this landscape. And they reacted to and created situations for their own benefit the best they could in these pretty bleak circumstances out here in the Trans-Mississippi South.
Thank you. Brian, what's the last book you published, and give us a one-sentence synopsis? Unmute yourselves, please.
Monumental, Oscar John's Radical Fight in Reconstruction, Louisiana. It is the first graphic history on the Reconstruction period, and it covers the life of the nation's first Black lieutenant governor, the first Black man considered for the vice presidency of the United States.
Cherisse, what's the last book you published, and give us a one-sentence synopsis?
Sure. I recently, in 2021, published Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas between 1914 and 1965. And I think the title says it all. It's about Black women's activism in rural spaces in Arkansas.
These books look familiar?
Oh, look at that. Now
Yes.
that's a good bouquet right there.
Yes, indeed. These books actually stay on my nightstand. So I see them when I go to sleep, and I see them when I wake up. So I thank you all. I just want to let you guys know I'm a fanboy in this whole event. I am a fan of historians because I'm a student of history, and I love learning new things, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we get into that, I got a couple of more questions to ask. What's the latest book that you read, Brian? From cover to cover, completely. Unmute yourself. If you just keep yourselves unmuted, that'd be great.
I just got finished judging for the Ragsdale, so I just read a whole bunch of books, including Kelly's and Cherisse Branch Jones's book, and they were both wonderful books and nominations for the award. I'd like to point out what I thought was interesting about both. First, Kelly, you're the first person to tackle slavery in such a broad way since Orville, who was the first chair of UALR's history department. So, I mean,
Was he? I didn't realize.
yeah, he was the very first one. So
Wow.
that's a huge monumental task, and you did a great job covering up.
Oh, thanks so much.
And Cherisse, your book was fantastic. It's the only one of its kind right now, and I hope to see a lot more books like it that are grassroots histories of everyday ordinary people lives, and tell us what was extraordinary that were going on in these communities of color. So it was fantastic, and I love the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cherisse, what's the last book you read?
The last book that I read from cover to cover is Don't Play in the Sun, One Woman's Journey Through the Color Complex by Marita Golden. And I started reading it after she gave a presentation at Pyramid Art and Books right there in Little Rock. Now I've got lots of books that I've half read because I don't have time to read them all, but that book I did read from cover to cover.
A chapter here, a paragraph there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even have time for the chapters anymore. A paragraph here and there.
Kelly, what's the last book you read?
Okay, warning, my spouse is arriving home from a work trip right now. So there may be dogs barking at any point.
I locked mine out of the room.
Yeah. You caught him.
Dog,
So sorry about
barking
that.
dogs are
When
fine.
you're by
You can
yourself,
go ahead.
you know, it's anyway, so there, my help is back. So the last book I read cover to cover was Medical Bondage by Deidre Cooper Owens.
Yeah, that was
About,
That's
and
the
I'm
girl.
not thinking of
yeah, that's a great book.
the second part of the title right off the top of my head, but essentially about the way Black women's bodies were used to develop our modern concept of gynecology. And a little bit on Irish women too, but to be honest, it's very little of the book is actually about the Irish women. So incredible book.
Deirdre Cooper Owens, I had her come speak at Arkansas State before the book dropped. She's a very good friend of mine and a sorority sister. So we've been together for a long time.
I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I made some men read that book this semester, and
Oh,
learned
good.
a whole lot of stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm going to get the book. Thank you for
You should get it. Absolutely.
Thank you for giving me that book suggestion. Now I have 1,000,001 books.
Mm.
So Cherisse, this is the last question I'm gonna ask everybody, then we'll get into it. If all four of us were to go to your house and have a meal and have this discussion over dinner, what would you serve?
Well, because I'm not a native Arkansan, I'm from the low country of South Carolina, it would probably either be red rice and fish, and where I come from, fish is not catfish, it's flounder, or it would be homemade shrimp and grits.
Homemade shrimp and grits. All right. Kelly, how about you?
I would make, I'm on a streak right now on buying local beef. So I would probably put in a local arm roast in the oven, very low for like 3 hours. And then we would be so distracted by how fork tender it was that we would never get anything else done.
Cut it with a fork, huh? Brian, how about yourself?
Being a native New Orleanian, probably barbecue shrimp and bread pudding with whiskey sauce.
All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, so this discussion is like a barbershop or beauty shop discussion. There are no rules. We can talk to each other. We can ask each other questions, answer each other's questions, talk over each other. We just want to talk and we just want to get this out. And after we talk for about 30, 40 minutes, then we're going to open it up for those who are watching to join the conversation as well. So first and foremost, I just want to say that my own experience with Black history in Arkansas was not a good one. It wasn't a good one because it wasn't until I graduated from Central High School and left Arkansas that I began to actually start learning about the history, Black history in Arkansas. I remember this was, I think 1994, 1995. I had just left the United States Air Force Academy and I was traveling the country doing some lecturing, and I was in an airport in Washington, DC. No, this is not 94. This is more close to 98, 99, something like that. But I was in an airport and I picked up the book Blood in Their Eyes because I needed something to read because I was flying from DC to Los Angeles and I needed something to read then. And by the time I landed in Los Angeles, I was infuriated and I was in tears at the same time. I was infuriated because I'd never heard anything about the Elaine massacre all through growing up in it. I was going on 30 years old before I learned about it. Second, I was in tears for the same reason. So I want to start our conversation with that, you know, my own personal experience with Black history in Arkansas. And I want to ask I want to ask the panel what led you to become a scholar in Black history? I know Cherisse and Brian, you guys are transplants to Arkansas. I think, Brian, you came first, Cherisse came after you. Kelly, you graduated from UALR, went to Texas and came back. But what is it that made you decide, I want to be a scholar of Arkansas Black history? Let's talk.
Can I start?
You don't raise your hand, just
Okay.
talk.
Well, I think as a native, my answer is going to be the least surprising one. So I'm going to defer to the.
Well, like Kwame, I didn't see myself and didn't hear about anyone who looked like me growing up in history. The most that we were told is that African Americans had been slaves. Then there was Abraham Lincoln, and he freed the slaves. And then Martin Luther King, and he got rid of all inequality. And all that we ever heard of, which made absolutely no sense because we saw inequality all around us. We knew of other people who were historic figures, but we very seldom heard about them. And my first experience, which I cover in the book Monumental, is this realization that I was related to this very important historical figure, yet he was never covered in classes. And he was critical to understanding what happened in New Orleans during Reconstruction and largely after its collapse. So nobody could answer the questions in high school, middle school. And when I got to college, I had my first African-American who was a history professor, Dr. Raphael Casimir. And he was the first person that actually knew of any of the characters that I'd read about, any of these extremely important writers and artists and musicians. And we talked about them all the time in class. And I absolutely fell in love with African-American history at that point. The thing that brought me to love Arkansas history really was the same thing with Kwame. I read Blood in Their Eyes during the time immediately following Hurricane Katrina, because I had nothing else to do. The school I had been teaching at was totally destroyed. I was going to be here for an indefinite amount of time. So I decided just to read more about Arkansas. And I stumbled upon that book. And I had this wonderful professor, Dr. Hirsch, that always used to say, when you read a book, make a list of questions that you know the book didn't answer for you, and go explore those questions. So I had a lot of questions that weren't answered, and I began exploring those questions. And that just led me to more and more history that wasn't talked about or hasn't been talked about ever here. And one of the things that I'm totally fascinated with now is Act 151 and the expulsion of free Blacks from the state. Arkansas is the only state that successfully kicked out its entire free Black population. And the idea that it only appears as footnotes, there's never been a total examination of that, is incredible to me. So I started trying to find out who was there in the census and then mapping where they went. So that was fascinating.
And then that story is so layered as well, you know, because there's carve outs for the free Black people they like.
Right, and that
like,
state,
you know, you have a bake store, so I love your pastries, so you stay.
Right.
No, Uncle Nate left. Pastry guy left.
Yeah, I do, but they made a carve out for him, but he said, no, I'm out just like everybody else is. But I think it was like, was it Duchesne County? About 700, several people in Duchesne County, I believe, they said that they weren't leaving.
Populations in the state.
That's interesting.
And the town, what I've been told is the town where they lived is now underwater. That area.
You got one of those in Arkansas too? Yeah. Oh my God.
So that's the next mission.
You can find anywhere else in the country, you can find in Arkansas. That's what I've discovered. As for my journey into Black history, I grew up in a household where we couldn't watch TV. Didn't matter. We only had 3 channels anyway. And my dad would only let us watch PBS, which I really resented until I became an adult. And that's pretty much all I want to watch now. But we read a lot. And when I was growing up, my parents bought us the Encyclopedia Britannica, and we also had the Ebony magazine Encyclopedia of Black History. And I read it religiously. My parents still have it at their house.
Ebony magazine had an encyclopedia of Black history.
Bennett Lee Ron, he wrote.
Bennett Lee, yep. And my parents still have it to this day. And I remember lying on the floor in the living room, just poring over that, because what I was seeing in those volumes, I wasn't hearing about in school. And Charleston is a city which back then had a fairly large Black population, but they weren't talking about that kind of stuff in school. But I knew those things existed, not in great detail, because I had that encyclopedia. My father also had us read books like They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima. He had, I read books by J.A. Rogers that were written way early in the 20th century. So I had a natural thirst for that kind of history, even though it was never taught to me at school. And quite frankly, I thought history was really boring based on what I was taught in the public school system in Charleston, but I had all these other things to read at home. So I knew that by the time I got to college, which was when I had my first African-American history professor, had an African-American history professor and an African history professor, and they just really made it all come alive for me, because with all this rich history, Black history in Charleston, back then in the 70s and 80s, nobody was talking about that. You would go visit a plantation and nobody was talking about the enslaved Black people who made this plantation work, who built and operated the plantation. They focused on the architecture or the horticulture. And I had a particular awakening moment when I was walking through, I think it was Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, and just marveling over the flowers and whatever. And my mom, who is a retired biology teacher, said, that doesn't grow here. They just planted that there. And that just ruined it for me. So I thought back then. And then I started thinking, they have scripted things in a very particular way so that we don't know to ask questions about those little houses along the side, which, by the way, were where the enslaved lived. Right? You didn't focus on that. You focused on the big house and all this architecture. And, so they didn't tell us any of that stuff. They didn't tell us that my enslaved ancestors were sold off of the Exchange building in downtown Charleston. When I was growing up, you had white women up there with hoop skirts on talking about, bless my soul, and sipping on mint juleps.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, I mean, and even when I worked for the Chamber of Commerce while I was getting my master's degree in Charleston, and they didn't refer to enslaved people as such. They called them servants. You couldn't talk about them as enslaved people. And so you would have people who would come to Charleston. This is slightly less the case now, but they pay money to ride behind these stinky horses that pee in the street to have people lie to them. And we couldn't tell them anything different, but I knew better, right? Because of the stuff that I had been exposed to at home. And when I was in college and in graduate school, I worked at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. Nobody talked about the fact that this was a school started for African Americans in 1865. People didn't have those kinds of discussions. And even when I gave a talk to the Medical University of South Carolina last night, talking about these Black medical professionals and educators, you wouldn't believe all the comments in the chats from people saying, I was born and raised here and had never heard of any of this stuff. So it was very clear to me that this information was intentionally withheld from folks.
Exactly.
And then you take that feeling and you come to Arkansas, and how do you deal with that feeling, dealing with Arkansas? Because you've uncovered some dynamic information that we all need to know about.
Well, to be honest, I didn't plan on being here this long. I really didn't. I'm glad I'm here.
You got sucked in, huh?
Yeah, I didn't plan on being here. I just didn't. And I wasn't interested in Arkansas history of any sort because I didn't plan on staying long. And then one day I looked around and I realized that, hey, I've got a pretty good life here. Arkansas has been very good to me. And my husband's from Arkansas, and this is the only place he's ever lived. And I just started, again, seeing some of the same things where there are very specific stories that people want to stick to and tell them over and over and over again. And I already knew that, there are other stories here. So how do we get at these other stories? And I also never saw myself as an agricultural or a rural historian. I didn't know what that was. I really didn't know what that was. And then I just happened to write a paper about rural Black women and home demonstration agents, really kind of, on a dare. I was told that home demonstration agents did the same thing regardless of race. And I was like, that's a bunch of nonsense, because if you're talking about Black women working in the rural South during the Jim Crow years, they're not doing the same thing. And then it became very clear that maybe the job descriptions were similar, but you're doing it in under dangerous circumstances. You're doing it with less money. You're doing it with people who are extremely impoverished. They are the poorest of the poor. No, you are not doing the same thing. I was also told that poor rural people weren't engaged in political activism. And I said, we have to expand our understanding of what political activism is. And so when I started digging into the sources, what I saw was, you've got these women who are going to home demonstration club meetings. And I've said this too many times. People will say, well, they're just canning tomatoes. Canning tomatoes ain't all that interesting. So the question is, what else are they talking about in these meetings? Canning tomatoes is important.
While they're canning the tomatoes.
Right.
Huh?
While they're canning the tomatoes, what are they
While
talking
they're
about?
canning tomatoes. And the canning tomatoes is important because food insecurity is a political issue, right? Yes. Trying to eradicate food insecurity is a political act. But they're also talking about poll taxes and potentially exercising the right to vote, or who their elected officials are. And a colleague of mine said this at a conference I attended in Texas years ago. She said something that always stuck with me. Do not equate rurality with ignorance. And that always stuck with me. And it really informed my research, because I was like, these are poor rural Black people in a lot of instances. They're not dumb people, they're just poor. And they're not all poor. And they're not all working on somebody else's land. What I discovered very quickly was they own the land and people work for them.
Right.
But most people don't think of Black people in rural spaces as people who are entrepreneurs, landowners, political activists, all of these things that are very true in the Arkansas Delta, at least, were things that nobody had ever been told. So for me, once I began to see all of these stories that hadn't been told, and all of this fabulous rural history, I was just absolutely smitten, absolutely taken in by it.
I feel the same way. Untold Stories was kind of my draw as well. I went to UALR and I took classes with the late great Fred Williams, who really emphasized the Western edge. Arkansas is part of the Western edge of the South. Like this is not Virginia. This is not South. There's something different, happening here. And then with classes with Money Hahn, who studied with John Hope Franklin. I mean, come on, you're going to soak in something, from that guy. And so I had kept this interest in Southern history. And then when I went to North Texas for the master's program, I thought I wanted to move further west in that interest. But then being there in those classes, Texans are really into their own history. I mean, it's weird because Arkansas history, like we're sort of apologetic about our history in a way. Texans, it doesn't matter how gross it is, they're like, yeah. And so I just kind of got Texed out, down there. And I was like, man, what about my state's history? Like, how come people aren't carrying the fire, back in Arkansas for their history and for sort of uncovering, these holes and stuff. And that was, to shorten the story, that was when I realized that there was nobody was really writing as much as I thought they should have been about slavery in Arkansas, and then for there not to be a book-length treatment, you know, that had an interpretation that looked anything like the way someone was talking academically about slavery in 2007-ish or whatever, in 2008, something like that. And so that was just sort of like became my mission, you know, was to just sort of uncover, you know, that history. And, you know, I was thinking about what you said, Brian, about that expulsion law. And I think part of the, I'm sure Kwami's going to lead us into some of these challenges and stuff, but one of the things that made me think of was that when I got into this, I got really fixated on the history of enslaved people, and we silo ourselves, right? And so like anybody who picks up my book looking for, and this is true for the dissertation and anything else, pretty much anything else I've written, you know, and if they're looking for the stories of free Black people in Annabelle, Arkansas, they're going to be very disappointed.
Exactly.
Not because I don't think that story is important, but because I had bitten off quite a bit to handle, right, as it was. And then I just kind of, you know, and so that's part of our challenge, right, is the siloing. I think another thing for historians interested in these topics is that sort of pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, right? Or sometimes it's this, is this an institutional history, or is this a history about the lived experience of African Americans? You know, and there's a place for both of those, right? Like we want to understand that structure. We also want to understand, you know, how it's affecting people. But sometimes I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're hamstringing ourselves by siloing, you know. And
let me ask you a question as far as that's concerned. Is the siloing, is that the result of something, or is that the beginning of something? Because I think of all of you guys, you have an expertise in a certain area, or several areas, to be honest. But I see them as pieces of puzzles that we need to start putting this puzzle together. I mean, your work, there's several other people's work that included in this puzzle. And when you get to the idea of Texas being very strong in state history, because you can't graduate in the state of Texas without passing Texas state history course. Same in Pennsylvania. So is the siloing, is that a product of this, I guess, is there some, first of all, is there some intentionality with the fact that Arkansas doesn't have Arkansas state history, which is a course that you must actually take and graduate from? Because I know here in Arkansas,
I have to correct you there. You do have to take Arkansas.
Yeah, I said something, that's something new, but I'm particularly.
I think it's in ninth grade. Is it ninth grade they have to have it?
Yeah, but now, I mean, we have to teach it on campuses, and you have to take it. So that you've got certain core courses, U.S. history, that are required by the state, that are required for people to take. So
I think our ed majors have to have an Arkansas history. Our history majors have to have the upper level Arkansas history. But I don't think just a regular, like, say if I was a business major, I don't think I would have had, I don't think I have to take Arkansas.
No, but all education majors have to.
Yeah.
But getting back to the question, as far as the siloing is concerned, because I thought that was very interesting. You're concentrating on this untold history, these untold stories in a weary land, was very productive, very meaningful. I learned a lot from reading the book. I personally don't think that it was a silo. I think that it was a piece of a puzzle. What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is sometimes it can be unsatisfying both as the author and the reader, and that there may not be a solution, you know, other than to say that I guess we just need to make sure that we're synthesizing when we get a chance, you know. So say when we're creating, when folks are putting together maybe like the college history textbooky type volumes, you know, that somebody would teach in a or assign to students, in a college Arkansas history class. Something to kind of bring those pieces of the puzzle together so that those books are talking, to each other.
There was also the issue of the availability of records and what goes to index in the past and make accessible in the past before there was microfilm computers, was indexing, and people had to selectively index, and they typically didn't choose African-American stuff to index. So it became incumbent upon those early scholars to really take that really laborsome task to scour through primary sources, scour through newspapers. They just couldn't go to an index and say, okay, article, go to 1920 page 4, where they could do that for matters that involved Anglo-American history. So it's always been more labor intensive. Doing sort of research has always been more labor intensive.
Oh, absolutely. Because when I think about my most recent book, a lot of what I used in that book wasn't in the archives, not in traditional archives anyway. Case in point, my last chapter on Annie Zachary Pike, I think there were a couple of mentions about her in the Arkansas Republican Party papers at the Butler Center. The rest of the information I got from scouring newspapers, and because I developed a relationship with Annie Zachary Pike and ended up going to her house where she had all of those resources, because all you would know by looking at research at the Butler Center is that, yes, she had some dealings with the Republican Party, the Arkansas Republican Party. When you find out just how deeply involved she was in the Republican Party, when you start looking at the resources that are warehoused down in Marble.
Indeed.
So,
and I was at her house 3 weekends after you were there, and she told me about your visit there. So that is an untold story, an untold story that needs to be told, because it gives a lot more of a robust history to, like you said, the Republican Party here in Arkansas.
Yeah. And I think, absolutely, because a lot of people don't realize that in Arkansas, Black people were loyal to the Republican Party in the 60s and the early 1970s. The narrative has been that all Black people ran to the Democratic Party. Right. Well, that largely depends on the state you're in. In Arkansas, there's some Black people who are voting Democrat, but there are people like Annie Zachary Pike who were Republicans, largely because of Winthrop Rockefeller. So, we have to be careful about these histories that generalize about a group of people's experience. A lot of that is very location specific, geographically specific.
One thing that I found when you talk about a narrative that's going through all three of your works is the story of organizing, resistance, self-reliance. Speak to that.
Well, in my work, and like I said, my work's been really purposefully pretty all over the place, but the recent stuff with the Free Blacks of Color in Arkansas and expulsion, wonderful tales of being able to reinvent oneself. And what a lot of people don't realize is overwhelming, the people who are being kicked out are overwhelmingly females. And this is in a terrible winter, January 1st, they have nowhere to go, and they go to different places and reinvent themselves. And a couple of things that we discovered that were totally wrong about history, like in Kansas, their narrative is that all of these runaway slaves came here right before the Civil War and helped us become a state because they needed migrants to come in to get statehood. But what they didn't realize was those were people who were running, they weren't slaves. They were free Blacks that were kicked out of Arkansas and where else wanted them. But Kansas wanted statehood. So they were taking everybody that they could to get that 300,000 head count. And this is a narrative that's being rewritten as, we're speaking, people are researching this and telling the narratives of people. And I love bringing the present into the past, doing family trees, finding the descendants of people that made this exodus, and finding out how if they have any tangible records that are still left from the 1860s, any family histories, and then exploring those family histories. And
what's also fun is when they find you.
Yes.
Right, because one of the things that has happened to me several times since my most recent book came out is that I get emails from people saying, oh, you're talking about my grandfather. Or for example, when I gave a book talk at Pyramid Art and Books, I was just sitting there minding my own business. This couple comes up to me, points to a woman on the cover and said, you wrote about our mother.
Right.
Wow.
My first question was, where have you been?
I was looking for, her family, right?
It would have, and I managed, of course, I have the skill set to piece the stories of, to piece their mother's life together, but how much richer would it have been if I had had information from her children, who are still very much alive?
To be an African American historian, and that doesn't, you want to go first or me?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing my chaos is not that controlled right now, but I just couldn't resist everything that you both, talking about women, right? Like a story that's default about men, unless you realize the pattern that has to do with these women being expelled and then bringing that part into the story. Or, for Cherisse, it's all over there. I did some kind of back of the napkin counting before we got on here tonight. And now nobody come after me because I've got a qualifier here. Since 1999, so 20-ish plus years of articles published in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, about 85 to 90 of them are specifically about African American history. Guess how many are specific of those 85 to 90, because I was just kind of going through fast,
Mm-hmm.
Guess how many are explicitly about women?
15.
None?
Okay, I heard of 15. It's lower. It's not none, Cherisse.
I said none.
Wait, did
So
you
it's
say
lower
nine?
than 15, you're saying?
No, there's
It's
less
4.
than 15, but 4.
It's 4.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, guess who they are?
Who are they?
2 on Daisy Bates.
Daisy Bates.
And Charlotte
1 on Minnie
Stevens.
Jean Brown Tricky.
Okay.
Nothing wrong with
Stevens.
writing about those women.
Right.
But those are women who.
And the fourth one?
The 4th one is Cherisse's about general, just not about a specific one person. Okay, so Cherisse.
Okay, why is there not an article on? Is it Mamie Joshenberger? Give me the correct pronunciation, Cherisse.
Mamie Yossenberger.
Yeah, why is there not an article on her?
There is an article
now
on her.
let me qualify. I did my count since 1999.
Okay.
So I don't know, I didn't because I knew I couldn't get it all. So I was like, okay, let's get about 20-ish, years. And also, I just want to say that's not a criticism of our wonderful editors of that journal, but just as a measure, right, of what's out there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
available information.
Right, Cherisse, what's our problem? What's going on?
We just can't seem to get it right.
Collections.
Yeah.
Well, yes, that's a lot of, and there is an article, Kwame, by Mamie Yossenberger. I wrote it. It's in the Fort Smith Historical Journal.
Yeah, and that's where I learned about her. And remember, I contacted you right after I read that article and thanked you for it.
Yeah. Well, and I thought it was important to publish it in that particular journal because local journals count. Local journals matter. Everybody wants to go to the big journals, the Journal of Southern History, whatever. It's like, no, the local journals matter as well. And I've talked to people who were born and raised in Fort Smith. They never heard of this woman before.
Yes.
I mean, this is a fabulous, fabulous story. But yes, it took me some time to piece it together, but not as long as you might think. I mean, this is a Black woman. I was able to trace her back to, she was born in New York. Her parents were from Virginia, so I was able to trace them through the census records. She ends up at Fisk, graduates in the same class as W.E.B. Du Bois. In fact, if you look at that famous image of the class of 1888, she's standing right next to him.
Still.
Here.
She's standing right next to him. And they write each other for the next, I don't know, 50 or 60 years until they die in the mid-1960s. So there's a whole, and I was just looking at this today. If you look up the W.E.B. Du Bois papers, and they're online at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and you just put in Jossenberger, which is spelled J-O-S-E-N Burger, there are like 35, 36, 37 letters between the two of them, talking about all manner of things. And I mean, and this was a famous woman. I mean, she was a well-known and a rich woman in Fort Smith, Arkansas. I mean, friends with W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. She went on vacation with them. I mean, and I have evidence of this, of them going on a cruise to Prince Edward Island. You know, how do we overlook, how do we miss women like that?
You have to remember when they lived. You have to remember,
yeah, absolutely,
and who controlled the journals at that point. You know,
right?
Allowed.
Right.
Well,
Who controlled the newspapers at that point.
One important thing that you said about local journals is, you know, when I was working as a curator with the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center, and I was traveling around the state of Arkansas for the Arkansas Black Schools Project, you know, trying to piece that story together. A lot of my information came from local journals. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
Let me go here. In 1991, Arkansas State Senator Dr. Jerry Jewell successfully introduced a bill that became Act 1233 of 1991 that officially established the Arkansas Black History Advisory Commission Committee. So that is the starting point in Arkansas, where we have actually the state officially recognizing that Black history is significant enough to actually have this committee. And I think about that time, 1991, I started learning about Black history about that time because I graduated from Central in 1989. But I want to ask you, since we're talking about Black history here in Arkansas specifically, why did it take so long for 1991 for the state of Arkansas to say, hey, we really need to do more about the study and the preservation of Black history? What's going on there? Is there some intentionality, or is there some lack of afterthought? What's going on there?
Do you want the cynical interpretation?
Yeah,
I just want you to respond however you want to respond.
I mean, my sense is that the generally conservative, small c conservative situation, the civil rights movement had shown that it wasn't going to ever, at least by that point, it's not scary anymore to white people, I guess what I'm saying. Like, things had kind of, by the time you get into the 80s, it's safe now to, you know, multiculturalism and like the things that people are wanting to talk about. I would say that the moderate whites that folks are looking to sort of sign on are more amenable to it, because it's sort of, a lot of this has been sort of declawed. Okay, so if you're going to open up to add Black history in, what'd you say, 91, it's going to be Rosa Parks was tired. You know, old lady Rosa Parks was tired. You know, Martin Luther King thinks you should be colorblind. You know, like, I don't know. And that's my cynical interpretation, is that became safe enough by them for the white people who you needed to buy into it. I don't know. Did I just say something crazy, or like, what do you guys think?
No, you hadn't, but I see it differently. You know,
Okay.
there was forced busing, and we had a generation of kids that grew up together. We had the Cosby Show then. We had,
Right.
this was a concession to say, look, we're doing things. Look, you know, this is progress that's being made. And I don't think they were fully aware of what they were doing. Trying to reverse. You're like, oh, we don't want him to know all the stuff. We should box. Let's put the lid back on it.
Right.
You know, that was sort of, I saw it as more of a political concession that was being made during that time when people are actually closer together. And for, like I said, I grew up in really the first generation of people in the 80s to go through school with whites, blacks to go through school with whites.
I did too.
Lives, you know? So there was an openness, and there were friendships being made, and people were watching these crossover shows. And that was a concession that was being made as people became increasingly more progressive about race. But like I said, that would have lasting effects, opening up people's imaginations and opening up history and making discussions of why things happen. You know, the political narrative that permeated everything before then. And that's the beginning of the erosion. And we could say in the intellectuals, the beginning of the erosion, you know, was the revisionists in the 50s and 60s. But for like middle schools, high school children, beginning of that sort of progressiveness in classrooms is the 80s and 90s.
Right. I quite agree. I too attended segregated schools, I think until, I'm going to say 1980, 1981 in Charleston, South Carolina. And I think a couple of things happened. There was this political moment on the one hand that made people look at this a bit more closely. On the other side of that, you had a whole generation of people who didn't understand who weren't taught how important African-American history is, and who were in fact were taught that it didn't matter. And I'm talking specifically about African-Americans, right? Because, you know, they're not having these discussions. They're not talking about a lot of those histories because they're part of a generation where much of what they experienced was so painful that they didn't want us to know about
trauma.
The trauma, yeah. And, you know, because I mean, I think about my parents, you know, my parents went to school in Greensboro, North Carolina, and people always hear about the sit-ins that happened in 1960, but there were subsequent sit-ins, right? There were subsequent sit-ins that my parents participated in. My dad went to North Carolina A&T, my mom is a Bennett Bell. They didn't want to talk about a lot of that because there was so much trauma, and they thought they were sparing us by not telling us those stories so we wouldn't transmit it to the next generation. Now, what happened is now we've got a generation of people who don't know this history at all, and who don't have an interest in that history because they were told it doesn't matter. It won't get you a job. You can't support your lifestyle, studying that kind of history. And I can tell you very personally, I come from parents who are a science teacher and an electrical engineer. And while there were books in my house, I was not encouraged to become a historian based on their experiences with social studies and history classes, right? That didn't really teach them anything about who and Black people were other than being enslaved laborers. And so when I said I want to study this and do this for a living, they were like, well, why? And, you know, they're incredibly supportive now. I mean, anytime I do a talk, you can trust my mama to tell everybody in the state of South Carolina. But once upon a time, they were deeply concerned that I was just sort of throwing my life away by being very stubborn about the fact that this was what I wanted to do.
Well, thank you for that. And we're getting ready to open it up because we've got a lot of people that want to be a part of this discussion. But you just said something, Brian, that I really want to, did I take it off of? Yeah, remove all spotlights. Yeah, you said something, Brian, that I really want to discuss. We talk in history, we talk about the who, what, when, where. but we don't talk about the why as much. And I think
Why is
problem
it
that
important is, and those connections
yeah,
are important. How does something relate in the past relate to the condition which we live in today is very important. Something in my classes you can't get around. And in fact, sometimes we start in the present and then move backwards in our discussions. So people have this really strong connection that the past does matter. You know, what happened in the past affects us every day, not some, every day.
indeed. For those of you that are watching, please turn your cameras on. You have, if you want to ask any of the panelists a question, please just raise your hand and we will get around to you. There's several things that have been placed in the chat. I will try to read them as I can. My prescription on my glasses is not as good as I would like it to be. So Carrie, maybe you can help me out with that.
I mean, you must be middle-aged.
Oh yeah, you see this?
I feel
You're
bad.
hanging
I'm right
on,
there
man.
with
You're
you.
hanging on.
I'm right there with you.
All right. Is there someone that wants to ask a question, or is there a panelist? Is there something that you want to delve into that we have not delved into? A name that I want to bring up before I forget, Kelly, is Mandy Buford. Mandy Buford, in your book, you talk about the story of her pregnant sister was going to be whooped by one of the enslavers, and how he was digging a hole in order to lay her on the ground. And
Right.
how did she respond to that again?
Now I can't, if it was the sister who goes after him, somebody protects this woman.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you
So,
caught me
yeah,
not remembering
Mandy
exactly.
Buford is the sister that went after her.
And protected.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
right. So yeah, she says that she's going to chop him up with the hoe.
Mhm.
And by the way, y'all, and I'm obviously taking a lot of glee in that threat. Okay, so the WPA interviews from the 1930s have that story. That kind of story is found pretty commonly. The story,
Right.
well, not, certainly the story of people trying to protect their family members, but at great risk. But the routineness of accommodating a woman's pregnant belly in order to face her on the ground and beat her, there was nothing sort of unusual about that part, shockingly, enough.
It was
but it also
shockingly
shows,
inhumane for me.
it also shows how
Ruth, I
much of
see your hand. We'll get to
a
you.
valuable commodity it is. You know, the idea
Right.
we can hurt you, but we don't want to hurt this unborn commodity that we're going to sell or have a mortgage on or borrow money against later on.
Well, it also contributes to the desexualization and the simultaneous desexualization and hypersexualization of Black women,
Right.
which still persists well into the 21st century. I was thinking about your point, Brian, about how the past informs the present. When I think about the classes that I teach and even the work that I've done, I think about rural history, not just in the past, but how it looks in the 21st century. And I got to tell you, not much has changed. You know, way back in the 30s, 40s, whatever, the big disease was tuberculosis, right? The big disease now is, HIV, AIDS, high blood pressure, diabetes, the list goes, and some of those things were the issues way back in the day as well. But I think the other point that's important to what you were saying, Kelly, about these women or these people defending their families is that it's not just about Black victimization, it's also about Black resistance.
Resistance.
Yes.
Exactly.
Right.
Always Black resistance. And I also want to be clear that it's not always Black trauma, there's also Black joy.
Amen.
Okay.
Right.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And also that resistance was multifaceted, and it was in different, you resisted certain way, your resistance fitted the situation and it fitted all of the circumstances as well. And that's one thing that I got out of reading your materials, Cherisse.
Yeah. And once again, it speaks to how, for all the effort that has gone in to trying to prove that these people were inferior, do you even begin to understand how incredibly intelligent you have to be to navigate a system that is hell-bent on keeping you oppressed? And the fact that the system is hell-bent on keeping you oppressed tells you something about how often these people resisted and how intelligent and clever they actually were.
Right. All right, we have a question. Ruth has her hand up. Ruth, please go ahead.
You know, I almost feel like I'm talking about the elephant in the room in terms of today. What are we going to do, guys? How are we going to teach this history when day after hour after hour, it seems like somebody in some legislature somewhere, occasionally in Arkansas, is telling us we can't teach any of this stuff because it might make someone feel bad. So I really want you guys to talk about how are we going to get around this, or how, you know, I mean, this is just, I'm just terrified right now with what's going on.
Panel, you wanna touch on what Ruth is asking?
What they don't want to do is explain what CRT actually is, because then explain what CRT actually is. You know, they don't even know what CRT is.
That's what I'm saying. They
Cherisse was
can't
able to
explain it.
Yeah, put them under a spotlight and watch them wither in the sun, because they have no idea what it is they're actually trying to prohibit. Actually have no idea. It's a way for them to toss red meat to the masses without giving them anything at all.
Right.
But if they pass the law, then they've won the battle. If we're not supposed to talk about the history, the real
How can we
history,
talk about any history without in the United States without talking about race?
yeah, so
Right.
I'm terrified right now.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing a lot of people go into the teaching field right now.
Right.
Right.
In fact, the number of teachers around the country is shrinking dramatically. The people enrolling, the people interested in becoming teachers, is just too much pressure being put on teachers. The teachers
Right.
that risk their bodies in these classrooms. We're not allowed to ask people if they've had a vaccine shot or a booster shot. So you're seeing resignations both in high schools, middle schools, and colleges. And you're under threat in many states, where actual families in some states can sue a teacher for talking about race. And my question has always been, when has it been comfortable for us to talk about history, about our past? Our past is supposed to be uncomfortable for us.
Right.
And that's why we change.
Right.
We don't change things that are comfortable.
Right. Well, and
Yeah,
but here's the other experience. Sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
I was just gonna say that I think that the more vulnerable group, say something like that does make it through, are the school teachers. And I think that certainly tenured professors, it's gonna be up to us to be incredibly stubborn. And I know this is recorded, and I'll just say, I will continue to teach my classes in exactly the same way.
Right.
I'm just not changing anything about my classes unless I think I'm needing to improve them in some sort of way. I'm not going to censor content for anyone. I don't care how they vote, and I don't care where they live or anything like that. But, and you know, my argument for that is that the state of Arkansas advertised for a position for someone who does my specialty, and I was courted, and I came here and took this position, and at a state institution, and so I'm doing the job that they asked me to do.
Right.
Right.
But you know, an 8th grade teacher is not going to feel empowered in that way.
Right.
And so we're really going to have to stick our necks out, you know, if the sort of worst case scenario thing happens, which I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit of a Pollyanna, but I kind of feel like maybe some of this is some grandstanding that will pass, but I'm also, you know, maybe a little naive to this.
Well, I understand exactly what you're saying, Kelly. I think there's something to what you said. First of all, I teach courses in African American and civil rights history. Now, if you want to feel good, stay home. Don't sign up for the class.
Yeah, don't sign up for the.
Don't sign up for, now, I'm not saying, again, it's not just about Black trauma, right? It's
Right.
also about Black successes, Black entrepreneurship, Black institution building, so on and so forth. So we're going to talk about that, but you also need to know what happened when people came in and tore all of this up and burned it down and ran all these people out of town.
Right.
You need to know. So if you're asking, well, why aren't they here anymore? This is why. And
Right.
one of the things that I've experienced far more often is students being very, very angry when my class ends, not at me. They're
Right.
angry because they have been denied this information.
Exactly. Students constantly say, why weren't we taught this?
Why weren't we taught this? I'm
That
angry.
why was a
Every
sovereign nation? Why weren't we
single day.
taught that
Yeah.
we went
This
to
daily
Puerto Rico
conversation.
and
Let me
colonized?
tell you, I have had students, I have taught students born and raised in Elaine, Arkansas. Never heard of the Elaine massacre. Spitting fire because nobody told them about it.
And their families were there then, you know?
And the families were there then, exactly. So that far more often has been
Yeah.
my experience. And on the other side of that, those classes are important for students from African descended students because they're not hearing stories about themselves that are empowering, or they're not
Right.
hearing stories about themselves at all.
Exactly.
But other people need to hear those stories too. And the stories they think they know need to be complicated. I've told my students for the past few years, Rosa Parks wasn't an old woman. I'm way older than Rosa Parks was back in 1955, and I'm not old.
Exactly.
But I mean, but we have to demystify
Mhm.
all
Yeah.
of that and complicate those narratives. And not only was she not old, she was not the first, not by a long shot.
Right.
Mhm.
And it wasn't a long time ago, you know?
And it wasn't a long time ago. You know, it wasn't a long time ago. So our job is to teach people how to think.
Yes.
Is to
I
teach
heard,
people how
I
to
heard that
think.
Rosa Parks wasn't even tired. She was just pissed off.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
indeed.
And you know, and the whole other thing about the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s, Black people didn't just start figuring out that they were being oppressed in 1950.
Right.
Ruth, one thing that I will tell you is that Arkansas is actually one of about 12 states that have a law that mandates the teaching of Black history. The problem is that mandated law is not funded. It's the responsibility of the Black History Commission of Arkansas to work with the Department of Education to create a curriculum and for the Department of Education to implement that curriculum. However, that particular statute has never been funded, so it's never actually really happened. So I think to your question on what we can do is we have to start talking to our legislators. We have to start pushing the button as far as public policy is concerned. We have to start talking to our superintendents and to our principals. And I will get that law for you so that you know exactly what it is. I don't have the citation off the top of my head. I wish Carla Coleman was on here and she
I
could
would
give
love
us
to see
that
that
citation.
too.
Do you know it, Cherisse? I know you're one of the committee. Do you know the citation?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, well, I'll get that and I'll get it to you, Ruth, okay? And let's work together. I know that Brian has been working with me, Dr. Guy Lancaster, George West, and a couple of other historians.
Political scientists.
Say again?
Doctor in political science. Oh my goodness, I can't think of his name right now.
Beavers?
No.
No,
He was just on sabbatical. He was at the Capitol with us.
Yeah. Well, still, we'll think of his name. But we've been working on getting legislation through to shore up that statute and also fund it so that the Black history can be something that's actually not only taught, but it's taught in a way where it's throughout the state, where it's not just Pulaski County, not just taught in Washington County, but it's taught throughout the state.
Right.
Dr. Wiebelhaus-Braun.
Yes, Eric Wiebelhaus-Braun.
Yes, yes, that's him.
Indeed. All right. We have about 10 minutes left in our scheduled time together. We had several people in the chat that were putting things in the chat. Is there anybody that put something in the chat that would like to come on camera and have a conversation with our panel?
Hey, Kwami, before anybody jumps in, just want to let everybody know we're going to let this go a little bit longer.
Okay.
So, anybody that needs to get 8:30, fine, but we're going to let it go a little bit longer because it's been a really great discussion. So y'all just keep running with it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's dangerous. That's dangerous.
Michael, do you have your hand up? You're muted. Michael, you're muted. I see you talking, but you're muted.
You said, do I have my hand up?
I'm talking about Michael Dugan.
Oh, okay.
Did that work?
Yeah, there you go. Go
There
ahead.
you go.
Okay, I want to make a couple of points very quickly. The textbook that was produced back in the early 60s, Historic Arkansas, they were just ordered to leave Black history, slavery, civil rights out of it, period.
Oh, Lord.
The first election we had, a free Black man named Bunch attempted to vote and was murdered by a mob. If you want critical race theory, I can give you cases, dates, events, and quotations, all stretched in a line up to the present and probably getting worse. We had a recent Republican legislator who praised John Wilkes Booth as the real hero, and Lincoln was a criminal. And if you know the facts behind that, Booth assassinated Lincoln because he had just heard Lincoln say that Black Union soldiers should deserve the right to vote. Now, to continue this very quickly, the problem with Arkansas history for many years was we didn't have a university press. And when we finally, what we, way back in those days, wanted to do was have a state's university press like other states do. Oh no, not with that outfit in Fayetteville, not one bit of it. So what happened? They created it, and then they kept trying to kill it off. And it's still alive, bless the Lord. But I mean, if there's something important like your museum, no, you get rid of it because we need the money for the football stadium.
Michael, I have a question for you, though. When you talk about the textbook that you talked about, you said they ordered for Black history to be left out of that textbook. Can you speak more on that?
Ferguson and Atkinson, if I remember, they were trying to celebrate, I think, I don't know whether it was the Civil War centennial or something, but they needed an Arkansas history book, and there hadn't been one written since the 40s. And so this was designed for the public schools. It was still in use. We were still teaching it in college in the 1970s in the absence of anything else. And both of those were, qualified historians, but the state was paying for it, and they got what they wanted.
Mm-hmm. Do any of you see a day where all of the information that is currently being discovered and compiled would be put into a Arkansas Black history textbook?
It's doable. And there are elements to that that carry in other areas, like Florence Price and in music and various artists and other things. It's a much broader field than just the politics.
Right.
That sounds like a job for David Scott Cunningham, doesn't it?
Well, none of these
A new
I'm
standard
inclined to
text.
agree.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to agree. I mean, I think for my part, of course, my time's a bit more limited now that I became an administrator, but I'm going to keep doing what I do. I'm going to keep researching. I'm going to keep writing. that's what I'm going to do. I can't do it all. I can't tell it all, but I'm going to research and tell as much of it as I can, and encourage other people to do the same, right? Because when I teach my classes, I tell my students, you can write about anything you want, but try to figure out what's going on right here in your backyard, because I promise you, anything that you think is going on somewhere else has happened here. Has happened here. And it looks a little bit different because many people just don't get that as a Southern state, Arkansas is a very different sort of place.
Yes, I'm so glad that you said that, because that's one thing that I have learned just in my study of Arkansas history is with Arkansas being a frontier state back in the days, it had so much colorful characters that came here, stayed, went through, and the history is just so rich.
It really is. And it is made up of people who come from all of these different places. I said this at another thing I was speaking at, and I said, you know, for African Americans in particular, you may think your family has always been here, but all you need to do is go back 1 or 2 generations and you came from South Carolina. It's no accident that I'm here. It's no accident that Brian is a transplant from New Orleans. That has always happened.
And there hasn't been a whole bunch of work done. There's been much more work done on the modern civil rights period here than anything else that deals with African Americans. So for younger scholars, and what I tell my students, you know, making a difference is much easier here than, say, somewhere in New Orleans, where people sort of converge on it by the thousands to write on its antebellum. Here, there's just so much that's undiscovered here. You don't always have to dig too deep before you run into a great story.
I completely agree. I mean, I was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, and you know, you talk about beating a dead horse.
Right.
But here you can tell a story that nobody else has told.
Exactly.
Easily.
Brian, you've been doing a lot of advocacy in your interviews for a teaching of the Reconstruction era. Tell us something that we didn't know about Reconstruction Arkansas as far as Black history is concerned.
Oh, one of my favorite stories about Reconstruction Arkansas, which I don't know if it's ever been told, but there was a shipment of guns, Springfield rifles, that came down the river, and the ship's captain that was transporting them had maintained that they were ambushed, and the men threw the rifles into the river so that they couldn't go to Union soldiers. However, when the riots in 1866 happened in Memphis and in New Orleans, reports came out that, you know, the registration numbers on rifles that were captured came from rifles that had supposedly been thrown. You know, this made many people in the Union believe that there was a network of confederacies, that, you know, the Confederacy was starting to reassemble and work underground, and that there was real potential for the Confederacy to rise again. And I don't know if that's a story that's been widely told, but it was an article I stumbled upon. I thought that was quite interesting. The connection that Arkansas had with both the Memphis riot of 1866 and the Mechanics Hall riot in New Orleans of 1866.
Wow. Yeah, that is new information for me. And there was Kelly, there was a similar story that you told in your book about, I cannot remember the name of this guy. Oh my gosh, I should have wrote it down. What's the name of the guy who was thought to be?
Oh, you're going to embarrass me. You're going to embarrass me because I'm not remember either. And then what am I going to do?
Once we write the books, we step away.
Yeah.
Move on.
You
It's
gotta,
a, it's a, it's
you know,
a
We move
brave
on.
novel.
it's like giving birth to a child. You're like, you have to rest a little bit.
You know, yeah, I mean, case in point, when somebody from South Carolina says, we want you to talk about your first book on South Carolina, I gotta go read the book.
Yeah,
Remember
exactly.
what you
Okay,
said.
so I'm feeling better. All right, tell me, Kwami, I may be able to remember the name.
No, I'm trying to remember the gentleman who was accused of trying to
Excuse me.
kidnap enslaved blacks and then start some type of a revolution or something like that. I cannot remember, because when I read his story, I thought of John Brown.
Rell's Rebellion.
Is this the John Murrell thing? The pirate?
John Murrell, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
the pirate of the Mississippi, or whatever it was they called him.
Indeed.
That guy.
Tell us a little bit about him.
Oh my goodness. Well, the reason it was on my radar is because there's been some really good scholarship recently on people kind of doing better justice to the expanding cotton frontier and how institutions are sort of up in the air. You know, the word frontier is kind of a fraught word, but frontier in this case meaning competing interests, and you know, it's just sort of a lot of, you know, a limited infrastructure and, you know, that kind of stuff. So essentially you've got these, the true story is that you do have partnerships, if you will, among of convenience among runaways from slavery, white people who are running away from debts or shady pasts, okay? These people converging in the swamps on the west side of the Mississippi River, and hiding and preying upon people coming, you know, up and down the river. And in some cases, I don't know how they're doing it, but forcing these ships, these boats to wreck, you know, and then descending upon them, and, you know, and whatever. So, okay, cool, you know, interesting story on the edge of the South. The interesting part for me was that how easy it was for whites who are trying to transplant an institution that they know and understand very well from the older, longer settled part of the South by white settled, right, part of the South. They're trying to transplant this pretty well developed strategy into a landscape that's not always cooperating, you know, with them in that way. And so the whole crux of it for me is the ability of enslaved people to you know, use that against them. You brought me here because this landscape is so-called wild, undeveloped, you know, fertile and ready for, you know, your designs. But the very landscape, the very features of this landscape that made it attractive to you in seeking profit are the things that I'm going to use against you to sort of slip out, you know, of this. And so the thing that John Murrell does is that he ends up sort of getting in with the wrong guys and accused of stirring up some kind of slave rebellion. And so the book, look at me, y'all. We just had this conversation about not knowing where your books are at. Here it is, Flush Times and Fever Dreams by Joshua Rothman. Does such a great job of showing how what characters like John Murrell, what we don't know how much of it's real, how much of it's sort of whipped up, right? But those kinds of characters on the, you know, I'm doing the air quotes in case you guys aren't looking, frontier, okay, show whites what's at stake if they don't tame this landscape to create the kind of productive, you know, cotton empire, you know, that they're looking for. Okay, I'm gonna button up and see what people think about that.
Oh, that's fine. Because when Brian talked about this ship, I went and thought about what you talked about in your book. So earlier, Cherisse, you said something that made me think of Blackville. And you just, within the last couple of days or so, did a presentation on Blackville. Why is Blackville not common knowledge here in Arkansas? And I'm sure Blackville was just one of many.
Right. I think I think number one, people either don't pass the stories down, or oftentimes the people who live those stories pass on, or their children move on, and people don't quite understand just how special what they had was. And a lot of time resources get lost, right? And then again, when you talk about, for me, it's always going to be about who has the power to determine whose stories matter and whose don't. You know, because I mean, a story, but here's the thing. I mean, and I know this is true because I wrote an article about that was also published in a local journal in Jackson County. If you were to look up this man in the Arkansas Gazette, Arkansas Democrat, whatever it was at the time, he pops up all the time. He pops up all the time. So the story wasn't but so obscure. All right. I mean, we know that he was in the Jackson County Republican Party. We know he was a member of the Farm Bureau Federation. And we're not talking about predominantly Black newspapers. He does appear in predominantly Black newspapers, but he appears in predominantly white newspapers. He was known all over because he was a wealthy African-American plantation owner in the Arkansas Delta. So people knew this story. People knew this story, right? But for whatever reason, in the 50, 60 years since, the story has gotten lost. It hasn't been passed down until I decided to write about it. Somebody had already written about it, I don't know, 25 or 30 years ago or whatever. And then I wrote about it again, introducing some things that they hadn't thought to consider before, quite possibly because the resources weren't available. But that's what I'm talking about when I say, you know, we have to dig. And also it's about being able to imagine people acting and operating in certain ways. For a lot of people, it would never occur to them that a Black man in the Arkansas Delta in the rural South could be a wealthy plantation owner. There's a cognitive dissonance there almost about that kind of thing, but it wasn't that unusual. It really wasn't. And it was one of the reasons why Black people came to Arkansas, because they knew they could get land.
Mhm.
Can I say something here?
Please, go ahead.
Okay. Pickens Blackville, Jackson County, was, as far as we know, the first African-American to get a pilot's license, and he used to fly over his tenants watching them pick cotton.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have all the articles from the newspapers about when he got the license in 1932, the kind of plane he had, the hangar they had at Blackville. There was even an ad, an article in one newspaper about him flying his daughter to school.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she can't get in the car and go to school like everybody else. He had to fly her to school. And again, a lot of this,
that's when you made it.
Huh?
I said that's when you made it, huh?
Right. And again, those articles are in white newspapers.
And his grandson, Joe Black, sometime banker, played on my integrated church league softball team in Jonesboro.
Oh, okay.
Right.
And there are people who live in Jonesboro. I'm thinking of one woman in particular whom I know because we used to go to church together. She grew up in Blackville. She knew the family. She knew the family, but for a lot of people, it is out of the realm of possibilities that there could have been a predominantly self-sustaining Black town with a church, its own store. Yep. They built their own school because Pickens Black gave them the land to do it. This was in the Arkansas Gazette, and it was a big spread in the Arkansas Gazette. So it wasn't as if people didn't know who this man was and what he had done. Every time they got a chance, they were writing about him.
Yeah. Well, that brings up something else as far as the Arkansas Gazette and the Arkansas Democrat actually writing stories about Black life and Black experience. And that, I assume, was a rarity.
No.
It wasn't a rarity?
No, it wasn't. That's another thing that's not true. People think, oh, if they write about Black people in the white newspapers, it's always going to be because they committed crimes. Nope.
Nope.
Nope. That's not true at all. I mean, yes, there is that, but they write about Black organizations, Black institutions,
All right.
Black businesses. They're in those newspapers.
Yeah, there was a Black oil company, right? Oil field company right in Pine Bluff.
Right.
Owned oil fields.
They wrote about, they wrote about Black owned cotton gins, and was it, so Pickens Black owned his own. There were a couple down in Marvel, Arkansas, down in Phillips County. This was in a white newspaper. It wasn't, you didn't have to go look at this. I mean, yes, they probably did make it into the Chicago Defender or the Pittsburgh Courier, which are historically African-American newspapers, but a lot of the information I got came out of the Arkansas Gazette.
Go ahead, Michael, and then I have something I want to say.
Okay, let me say this very quickly here. Another untapped source, as far as I know, is a lot of the still digitalized county newspapers who had columns from our colored correspondents,
Right.
along
Right.
which is again a example of the rural life stories that make history livable,
Right.
despite our legislature.
And yeah, I'd like to speak to what Cherisse and Michael both mentioned. My first history job was working, doing the inventorying the newspaper collection at the Arkansas History Commission. It was part of a national project. Well, it was part of the state project, Arkansas Newspaper Project, in the late 80s and early 90s. And that was part of a national project, state by state. Each state was doing a cataloging of all of their state's newspapers. And I didn't learn anything about Black history in elementary school, middle school, high school, college. My first knowledge of Black history in Arkansas was at doing the Arkansas Newspaper Project and going through frame by frame of all those newspapers. and I mean, not literally reading every single frame, but I had to scan each and every issue of each and every paper. And yeah, there were a lot of stories about Black Arkansans in there. Most of them weren't lengthy features, but yeah, there were lots of little stories about prominent folks and what they were doing, and and occasionally there was a mention of some controversial incident or something, and that it was all a revelation to me.
Yeah.
I had never heard of a lot of that until I got into the newspapers there.
And to what somebody's saying about being able to read and electronically, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I can spend hours upon hours upon hours looking at digitized newspapers. And you know what makes it even better? In my office, I have 3 computer screens.
Yeah.
And I have to remind myself that you're the dean of the graduate school. You have to actually do dean stuff.
Yeah.
Because once you get started,
it's hard.
It's hard to tear yourself away. But good folks, I'm gonna have to get off here now.
Yeah, I was getting ready to bring this to a close because I have to eat dinner myself. I can smell it. So I'd like for each of our panelists to give us one final thought as far as where do we go from here? Brian?
Well, my big thing has been increasing accessibility and working with teachers who might be uncomfortable on the secondary and primary, in the primary and secondary grades. Help them to teach difficult histories, give them resources, help them create lesson plans, and help get this knowledge out, because the way we change the world, it's actually one student at a time.
Kelly?
I will agree with that wholeheartedly, and add that this is an overlapping group, right? We need to encourage young people who want to study African American history and create original contributions to that scholarship and dig in the archives, we need to find the money, find the resources, create an independent study. We need to get creative to encourage people to sort of fill in, you know, some of those gaps for sure. There's room for many more people to get in on this, and we just need to make sure that people don't feel the way. And maybe I'll just speak for myself, but well, actually, you know, Cherisse, you said the same thing about your parents. When you say you want to do history, everybody just sort of freaks out, you know.
Right.
And we've got to help. You know, we've got to support, realistically, you know, support and encourage, and we've got to funnel, you know, these brilliant young people into this, or else we're going to look around and end up with a drought, you know, again. So
I would say do the work, because Arkansas history stories travel internationally. I've given talks on various aspects of what I write about in Arkansas history in Paris, Spain. I got a special invitation to go to England to talk about Arkansas genes teachers before the British Agricultural History Society. People want to know.
Exactly.
They may not be able to find Arkansas on the map, but they want to know.
Exactly.
And what I'll say, I first of all thank all of you for participating, and I pray that we can talk to Carrie about this being the beginning of something that we can continue this conversation. But I am committed to getting that history book done, Michael. So we all need to work on that. And Cherisse knows it because I've been putting in applications for grants. And I've sent them to her to look over and everything. So I'm really committed to getting that done before I just give it all up and move to some island in the Pacific and y'all don't hear from me again. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie. Thank you, Carrie, for making this possible.
Well, thank you all for agreeing to participate. It's been a wonderful and very informative and enlightening, engaging meeting, and just love to hear all the insights that y'all shared with us. And I couldn't agree more. You know, sometimes there are going to be problems with getting the word out, but you know, we've got to do the research and get it out there. And then, as I think, as Brian said, people will want to find that information. So we just got to get it to them. So thank you again, everybody. Brian, Kelly, Cherisse, and Kwami. And thanks for all of our audience for tuning in, and hope to see you the next time we do one of these programs. Good night, everybody.